Good morning, U.S. history students. Today we're going to be doing note 6.3, the Civil Rights Movement, Black Nationalism. Your essential question: how did Black nationalism differ from civil disobedience? All right, so remember, we're covering a lot of time here in the United States. African Americans were first brought to this country as enslaved people from Africa way back in 1619. Slavery existed from 1619 all the way up until the end of the Civil War, the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. So, the majority of the time African Americans have been on this continent, in this country, they were enslaved. So, what we're looking at today is the period of segregation. So 1865 to 1954, and then we're looking at civil rights, which is this green section here. So civil rights, how they have progressed from 1954 until today. The civil rights movement had done much to bring an end to segregation by law. So they were trying to challenge these things in the court system. But in fact, most of the United States was still in this de facto segregation. So segregation that still exists through custom and through practice. So in the 1960s, there was a lot of race riots that were happening across the United States. They happened in Watts in LA, they happened in Harlem in New York, they happened in Chicago and Illinois. They were happening all over the place because people were getting fed up. Kind of like what's been happening in 2020 in the United States today. People have been fed up with the treatment of African Americans, and so they have been fighting back against unjust treatment. So President Johnson responded to the race riots with the war on poverty. So he believed that putting more money into these cities, into impoverished communities, would help to fix some of the social unrest. So remember, this was the Great Society programs that he had established, and we talked about that in our last unit. The Vietnam War drained money from a lot of these programs. Unfortunately, the Vietnam War was very expensive, and so a lot of these programs kind of got put on the back burner, and we focused on fighting that war instead. Dr. King said that the Great Society program has been shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam. So we started to have fractures in the civil rights movement, which we talked about at the end of our notes 6.2. So we had all these nonviolent groups. We had SNCC, we had CORE, but members were beginning to question nonviolence. In 1966, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they abandoned the philosophy of nonviolence. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they formed the Black Panther Party, and they called for a violent revolution as means for African American liberation. And Malcolm X and the Black Muslims, they were critical of Dr. King and his nonviolent strategies. So Dr. King and Malcolm X were two prominent figures in this movement, but they had very different views on how they should go about gaining civil rights in this nation. So Malcolm X was actually born in Nebraska. He was born as Malcolm Little. He was the son of a Baptist preacher, and he and his father encouraged African Americans to stand up for their rights. But his father was killed by white supremacists in Michigan in 1931, and that kind of was very detrimental to the mental health of his mother. And so Malcolm and his siblings moved up to Harlem during that time. He unfortunately was dealing with a lot of issues in his early age, in his teenage and early 20s. At the age of 20, he was arrested for armed robbery. He was involved in gambling, drug dealing, all kinds of things. And when he went to jail, he started studying the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the Nation of Islam. Often, a lot of people perceived his teachings as racist. He said that he wanted a complete separation of whites from blacks in society. So he expressed the idea that black people were the first people to rule the world. We have traced back humanity to Africa. So he said all of humanity, all of existence is from black people. And so Malcolm X started following Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam was an activist group, and they believed that African slaves were originally Muslim. the Nation of Islam wanted to create a second black nation within the United States. And at this point, Malcolm Little takes on the last name X. Instead, he takes on the name Malcolm X because X symbolizes the rejection of his slave name. Of course, he did not know his original name when he was brought over here, when his family was brought over here, when they first were enslaved from Africa. And so he took the name X instead to symbolize the unknown, to symbolize the fact that they did not know what his name was, and the rejection of Little, the slave name that they were given. So Malcolm X was a very passionate speaker. He said that you cannot separate peace from freedom because no one has peace unless he has freedom. He said, nobody can give you freedom, nobody can give you equality, justice, or anything. If you're a man, you have to take it. He started to have tension with the Nation of Islam in the 60s because Elijah Muhammad was having affairs, so he was not being faithful to his wife, and adultery is against the Quran. It's against Muslim faith, so he believed that he should not be, committing adultery. And so Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad started having, conflict between the two of them. And then the Nation of Islam blamed Malcolm X for his controversial remarks regarding John F. Kennedy. So when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Malcolm X said that the assassination was an example of the chickens coming home to roost. He said that because JFK wasn't doing enough to prevent the violence that was happening to African Americans, the violence was eventually going to find him. And so that's what he meant by the chickens coming home to roost. So in 1964, he was having all these conflicts with his group, the Nation of Islam, so he decided he was going to take a pilgrimage to Mecca. This is something that Muslims are supposed to do at one point in their lives, and so he decided to do this in 1964. When he got to Mecca, he discovered that Orthodox Muslims actually preached equality among the races. They didn't want to separate the races, they believed that they were all equal. And so this caused him to desert his argument that white people were the devil and that they shouldn't be associated with African Americans. But unfortunately, just about a year later, in 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by a black Muslim at a New York City rally. So he said that he knew he was being followed frequently before he was assassinated. He said he knew that people in the Nation of Islam were trying to kill him. And he was shot while addressing a crowd in a church. So there's about 400 people in a church. He was up there giving an address to everyone. And his autopsy identified 21 gunshot wounds to his chest, shoulders, arms, legs. Members of the Nation of Islam were arrested for the assassination, but a lot of people accused COINTELPRO, which we'll learn about a little later, and other FBI programs about infiltrating the association, and so they blamed them instead of the Nation of Islam. There's a lot of different conspiracy theories out there about the assassination of Malcolm X. We sort of have these three fractures in the Black national movement. We have Black Power, which is led by Stokely Carmichael. He is the head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Black Power became this new rallying cry. They wanted African Americans to depend on themselves to solve their problems. The Black Panthers were formed in Oakland in 1966. They called for a violent revolution. They believed that they needed to have guns and protect their neighborhoods against police brutality. And the Black Muslims were, of course, like we just talked about, the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X. They were promoting Black nationalism, self reliance. So, Black Power emphasized racial pride. This term Black Power um, promotes Black nationalism and promotes Black power in these political and social institutions. The Black Panthers performed right here in the Bay Area. They were formed in Oakland. They were fighting back against police brutality in urban areas, and they advocated for full employment, for good housing for African Americans. They said that African American men should be exempt from military service. They weren't being treated equal in this country. Why should they have to fight for this country? They actually established free medical clinics, free breakfast programs, daycare centers, assistance to the homeless. They established a lot of social programs in Oakland to help people out. They also preached self defense, so they were teaching people to arm themselves, how to use weapons, how to be safe. The Black Power symbol was seen at the Olympics in 1968 when Tommy Smith and John Carlos both won. So they gave the Black Power symbol, which was the fist up, in 1968. They were suspended by the Olympic team and banned from the Olympic Village, which is where they all stay. But this was considered a milestone in the civil rights movement. They used their platform, a worldwide platform, to preach their movement. So, like I said, the Black Panthers were formed in 1966 in Oakland. They believed that the violent revolution was the only way to achieve freedom. So, in the 1960s, they got in a lot of violent confrontations with the police. There was death on both sides. Black Panthers died, police died. Huey Newton was tried for killing a police officer. And the movement started to begin to expand across the United States. So we had the Watts riots that happened in LA in 1965, the Detroit riots in 1967, and there was a lot of riots after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So Dr. King was assassinated. He was killed by this guy, James Earl Ray. He was shot while he was standing outside of a balcony where his hotel was. Within hours of the nation finding out that he had been assassinated, rioting erupted in more than 120 cities. Within 3 weeks, 46 people had died in these protests, more than 2,600 were injured, and more than 21,000 people were arrested. The Black Power movement was a threat to the United States government. The FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover created a secret program to keep an eye on all groups that he believed kept or created an unrest in American society. He considered Dr. King and Black Power to be a threat to America, and he spread false rumors that the Black Panthers intended to kill SNCC members. So they were trying to cause conflict within these groups as well. But J. Edgar Hoover did not like Dr. King. He called him a notorious liar. He called him a communist. They began to wiretap Dr. King's home, his office, his hotel rooms. They were spying on him constantly. They paid informers that worked for Dr. King to spy on him and release information to J. Edgar Hoover. And when Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI encouraged other countries not to invite him to come speak. So outside of the United States, they were even infiltrating. Hoover had the IRS examine Dr. King's tax records very closely, and he tried to prevent a national Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which we all know we have every January. We get that day off of school. He attempted to split up Dr. King's marriage, the FBI did, and the FBI tried to encourage Dr. King to commit suicide. They taped an affair that Dr. King had with various newspapers, and that they taped an affair that Dr. King had, and they sent it to various newspapers trying to get them to publish this material. But all the newspapers declined to publish it. It wasn't really seen as socially acceptable back then to post about people's affairs, which I know is very different than now. Now it would be all over every newspaper, but back then it was something that the newspapers declined to publish. So the FBI tried to destroy the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, this here on the next three slides, is their mission statement. They wanted freedom, they wanted the power to determine the destiny of their own community, they wanted jobs, they wanted housing, shelter, education. They wanted Black men to be exempt from having to serve in the military and go fight in Vietnam. They wanted an end to police brutality and ending to police murdering Black people. All these things seem pretty understandable that they would want in their community. The Black Panthers also established breakfast programs. They, did food drives and gave food to people who needed it. They had free healthcare clinics where doctors would volunteer their time for people who didn't have health insurance. They created a newspaper to publish information about what was happening in their community. They were very popular in the Bay Area. And they carried guns to protect themselves and their community against police brutality and profiling. So at the time, there was no really open carry laws or anything like that. Lots of states let people just carry their weapons out in the public. So walking up to the Capitol, this year is in Sacramento, walking up to the Capitol with their guns was totally acceptable. So they went to Sacramento to protest a law that banned carrying weapons in public. They marched to the Capitol building in Sacramento carrying their rifles. And so the FBI began to see them as a threat. I know you've seen some pictures that are like this in the United States just this year. We had a lot of people doing the same thing when they were protesting over George Floyd's death as well. So, COINTELPRO was an FBI program. COINTELPRO was short for Counterintelligence Program. This program was established to spy and sabotage on American activists against protesters. It was founded in 1967, and its goal was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize Black leaders and organizations. So they would frame these leaders, planting evidence to make someone look guilty. They would have fake evidence in trials. They would forge fake letters to different groups. They would try to create tension within these different groups, like between SNCC, between the Black Panthers, different groups that were associated. They either committed assassinations or they provoked other people to commit assassinations. They even went as far as creating coloring books for children. The FBI accused the Black Panthers of creating militant coloring books whose purpose was to indoctrinate children. So, as you see, there's kids here in this Black Panther book. Kids have guns. They would have like pictures of cops and they would be calling them pigs, things like that. But the Black Panthers actually didn't make this book. They didn't send this book out. This book was created by COINTELPRO. So, it was created by the FBI to try to frame the Black Panthers and say that they were indoctrinating young children. Fred Hampton was a well-known Black Panther in Chicago. He was very young, he was only 21, and he was very successful at organizing the free breakfast programs and free health clinics in Chicago. So he helped to encourage blood drives to help people who were facing sickle cell anemia, an illness that targets African Americans. And he brought together gangs that were fighting together or fighting against each other in Chicago. So different gangs that were fighting, he encouraged them to clean up their act, to contribute to society, and to come together. He believed that the real enemy was the FBI and police brutality, and they needed to be fighting back against that, not each other. He was very popular, and because of his popularity, that made him a target by the FBI. So the Chicago police had a police informant, so they were paying this guy, his bodyguard, William O'Neill. William O'Neill drew up the floor plans of his apartment and they gave it to the FBI. And the FBI and the police went ahead and they raided Hampton's apartment at 4 a.m. They went and they were going to knock down his door. They were accusing him of committing crimes. Of course, 4 a.m., everybody's asleep. They hear this pounding on the door. They assume that someone is coming in to harm them. So there's one shot that goes off from inside the apartment. So someone's shooting. They don't know who's outside, but they're shooting at the person who's outside the apartment who they believe is breaking in. The police respond with 99 shots. So they just start blasting up the apartment. Two people were murdered, four people were wounded. One of the people that was wounded was Hampton's pregnant wife, who was right next to him. The survivors were charged with attempted murder. Some suspect that Fred Hampton was drugged because he never woke up during this ordeal. They tried to wake him up, but he couldn't wake up, so they assumed that he was drugged. The police fired at least 99 bullets, and the Panther shot once. This was suspected to be a political assassination, and so there was a huge investigation into this happening. Eventually, the police admitted that it was a political assassination. They admitted that they went in and they were going to kill Fred Hampton, and so the police had to pay $1.8 million to Fred Hampton's family. So there were some successes in the movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 banned discrimination in housing. They started passing affirmative action programs, which gave preference to minorities and women in hiring and admissions to make up for past discriminations against these groups. The decline of the Black Power movement was due to the police and the FBI and the Black Panthers. The police began to raid the Black Panther headquarters in many cities. They were doing things like assassinating their leaders, like Fred Hampton, or throwing them in jail. There was a lot of armed conflict. They killed or arrested many of the members of the Black Panthers or many of the leaders. SNCC was also collapsed with the help of the FBI. The FBI was encouraging conflict between the group, and so the membership began to decline. And many consider 1968 to be the end of the movement. Again, that's when Dr. King was assassinated. There was riots all over, and June of that year, Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, who was also running for president in 1968, he was assassinated in California, in LA, when he was running. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was a success for some anti lynching laws prohibiting discrimination in housing. The Black Power movement still is going on today. Of course, it never died. It's still going on today. So there was very many successes throughout the movement. Thurgood Marshall became the first African American Supreme Court justice. Congressman John Lewis, remember he was protesting in Selma and he went on to serve in Congress for the entirety of his life. We just lost him this year to pancreatic cancer. Jesse Jackson formed Operation Push, and Barack Obama became the first African American president in 2008. And then, of course, we still have the Black Lives Matter movement today, fighting back against police brutality. Some of these things that they were fighting about way back in the 1960s, we're still fighting about today. So that's the end of your notes. Go ahead and write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.